I want to pick up where we left off. We were talking about how by the summer of 1941, evolution of Nazi Jewish policy had reached the point where the fate of Soviet Jews was sealed, that the Nazis had evolved through a kind of, from three different expulsion schemes, the Lublin Reservation, Madagascar, Siberia, to at least a vague understanding of an implied genocide in the future, that by some way, some timetable, some method, there would be no Jews left in what Hitler was proclaiming to be a German Garden of Eden in the new territories they had conquered. And then the issue that remained was the fate of the other European Jews to the west of the Nazi-Soviet demarcation line, the territories Germany held before the invasion of the Soviet Union. And I would just back up a little bit to try to put this in a bit of context. For a long time, historians assumed that there was a decision and an order for the final solution. And indeed, the fact that we couldn't find that order, that piece of paper, or document that decision was often exploited by Holocaust deniers to say it never happened because we don't have the order that set it off. Historians now, I think, accept that there is no Big Bang theory for the origins of the Holocaust. There is no point at which there was one decision on one day in which Hitler says, we will now kill all the Jews of Europe. And what we've been looking at is an incremental decision process that drags out over a long period of time, in which the Nazis edge more and more towards the most radical solution. And that within that broader evolution from 39 to 41 that we've been tracing since last Tuesday, certainly one can see a narrower partial decision-making process for the fate of Soviet Jewry from the time that Hitler announces the war against the Soviet Union will be a war of destruction, different from anything the Nazis have done in the previous occupied territories, to mid-July to early August, when clearly people now understand what is expected of them, the retargeting away from adult male Jews and adult Jewish leadership to Jewish women, Jewish children, the Jewish elderly, and the vast increase in the daily body count of the killing units from the previous kind of three-figure days to four- and five-figure massacres that are beginning to be reported by mid-August. All I would say signify that we have reached closure in this decision-making process concerning the fate of Soviet Jews. That then sets the stage for yet another decision-making process that will stretch out over several months, and that is the fate of the other European Jews under Nazi control, a process that is inaugurated, not finished, but inaugurated with Reinhard Heydrich going in to see Goering at the end of July and getting the so-called Goering authorization, the authorization to draw up a feasibility study. How could this be done? What Goering is ordering him to do is to bring back a plan. It's not an order to kill Jews. It's an order to bring back a plan for a total solution to the Jewish question, is one sentence, a final solution to the Jewish question in the concluding sentence. And the question then is, how do the Nazis now operate in a terrain for which they have no precedent? Up until now, the way things they've been doing, there's been some model to operate on, even up through massacres by firing squad, and so forth. But now they're reaching a point for which there is no model to follow. They have to invent this out of themselves, and that the beginning of this, and what really one crucial component of this, is what I ended with last time, which was the invention of the death camp. If you combine a deportation apparatus that will carry the victims to the killers, not sending the death squads to the victims, but carry the victims to the killers, located in concentration camps where things can be done more secretly, particularly when these concentration camps will be in some obscure corners of Poland, and equipping those camps with the gas chamber technology that had been developed for the T4 program that had been used to kill German mentally and physically handicapped. As I emphasized, the first victims of German poison gassing are fellow Germans. They are German physically and mentally handicapped. Some 70,000 are killed by the summer of 1941. Probably that figure will reach 150 to 200,000 by the end of the war, of Germans killed by other Germans because they are viewed as a blemish on the biological purity of Germany and as a burden, people needing too much care that they would pursue, like the convenience of simply getting rid of. But that, is the real innovation the Nazis make. They invent a factory to kill people on an assembly line basis, whereby a minuscule number of perpetrators are actually involved in the killing process itself, even if the infrastructure to make that possible is vast. All the people involved in rounding up Jews, isolating them, putting them on the trains involved lots of people, but they are hundreds, if not thousands of miles from the actual killing, and it is a very small portion of people. Treblinka, with a death count of 900,000 in 54 weeks, has 30 German SS men running the camp, using some 120 Ukrainian guards, 800 Jewish slave laborers. So that the ability of the Nazis to industrialize mass killing is in a sense the key conceptual breakthrough that they're going to make for this second phase of the decision-making process, how to extend systematic and total mass murder to the rest of the Jews of Europe. Then the question is, when does that take place? How do we date that? What is the parameters of that decision-making process? If it begins at the end of July, when does it reach closure? And I will argue it basically reaches closure by late October. It's going to be roughly October, September, into October for all of this to become clear. The point at which the Nazis know exactly now where they are going, where clarity about what they are doing has been achieved, and people now know how to work towards the Fuhrer in this particular program. In fact, August is a slow month. Heydrich got his authorization from Goering at the very end of July, and immediately turns to Hitler and asks, can we begin deporting Jews from Germany? We can begin to get the Jews out of Germany, begin sending them east. And Hitler says no. This is a point at where initiative from below is rejected. And he says not until the military situation in the east is clarified, not until the war is basically won. Goebbels in August comes to him also proposing that, and he gets the same answer. You don't begin this process against the Jews of the rest of Europe until the war in the east has been won. So, in part why he's doing this is because they say militarily things have come to a halt. By late July, the Nazis have advanced so far, so fast, that they have to stop, they have to refit, and they have to decide where they will proceed from there. There is an argument between Hitler and his generals in August that also distracts Hitler. The generals want to head straight forward on the Central Front to seize Moscow. And Hitler decides that it is more important to take out in the northern front the city of Leningrad and the southern front Kiev, to remove the Soviet Union's capacities economically to continue war if you knock out these regions and then you dash to Moscow after that is done, and the Russian Colossus will collapse. When there's an argument between Hitler and his generals, guess who wins? In late August, early September, the offense is resumed, and it is an offense into the Ukraine to seize Kiev, and an offense into the Baltic to surround Leningrad, which of course will be under siege, surrounded all the way up until 1943. In any case, those initial offensives go very well. That Leningrad is surrounded in the first week of September, and Hitler's plan now is not to waste lives on street fighting, but simply to surround the city and starve it out. After all, he has the hunger plan to starve millions anyway, and Leningrad will be, in a sense, the first example of the hunger plan in action, that the city is simply to be surrounded anybody trying to break out to be shot, forced back in, and you starve the trapped population until they simply cease to exist. In the south, they break through on the southern front and move in towards Kiev. By middle of September, clearly the offensive is back in motion, and Hitler begins to see light at the end of the tunnel. And it is on the weekend of September 16-17 that he meets with a number of his major leaders. And on the following day, September 18, Heinrich Himmler sends out a very important letter to one of his subordinates, the man in charge of the central region of the incorporated territories, where the great ghetto of Lodz is located. And Himmler writes to him what amounts to a kind of bad news, good news letter. And he says the bad news is that Hitler has decided to clear the Third Reich of as many Jews as possible before the end of the year, so that we are going to send tens of thousands of Jews to you. The Lodz ghetto was already packed with 175,000 Jews. It's absolutely crammed, and they don't want more Jews. But Himmler says, I know this is a great inconvenience for you, but the good news is, come spring, next spring, all of these people will be sent further east. So this is a temporary way station. Lodz is to be the warehouse to get Jews out of Germany as soon as possible. And next spring, they are going to be, quote, sent further east. No further explanation about what that means. When Hitler meets with others, leaders in late September, he is now convinced the war is almost won. He thinks the fighting will be over by October 15, and that once again, once the military situation is clarified, the deportation trains can begin to roll. And true to that timetable, on October 15th, the day Hitler predicted the fighting would end, the first Jewish transports from Germany begin to go, first to the ghetto at Lodz, and then to warehouse them in the ghetto at Minsk, the ghetto at Riga, and to send them also to Kovno, where the local Germans don't want to put them in the ghetto, so that's the place where, in fact, they execute all the German Jews as the trains arrive, the first mass killing of German Jews by firing squad, as opposed to the fate of Soviet Jews, who, of course, are being dealt in this way already for a number of months. So the deportation program is set in motion on the predication that by the middle of October, when these begin, the war is virtually going to be over, and that those who are receiving these deportations are not to worry because they'll all be sent on further east in the next spring. That then raises the question of what does send them further east next spring mean? Is this still a notion of the Arctic and Siberian reservation? Or is now a different idea lurking behind this euphemistic phrase, send them further east next spring? We know the Nazis themselves, initially at least, were wondering what this means. And as Heydrich is wrestling, in a sense, with his authorization, what does he have to do to come back to Goering with a plan? There are others that are volunteering to help. And we have a remarkable letter from a man named Herpner, who was one of the ethnic cleansers in the incorporated territories, bucking for a position back in Berlin. He's a good friend of Adolf Eichmann's, and he writes to Eichmann, and basically he's writing a letter kind of applying for a position to be brought back to Berlin to be in charge of much more bigger scale programs than his clearing ethnic cleansing in the area around the incorporated territories. And he clearly has heard that some struggle with planning is going on. This is what he writes on September 2nd. He says basically he assumes that proposals for the resettlement of alien populations is taking place for, quote, reception areas in the East. Doesn't more specify than that. But he says basically all of these plans have to be, in his term is, patchwork, since, quote, I do not know the intentions of the Fuhrer. And he goes on, first of all, before he could actually contribute and make solid proposals, quote, basic decisions must be made. It is essential in this regard, by the way, that total clarity prevail about what finally shall happen to those undesirable ethnic elements deported from the greater German settlement area. And this is now the key sentence. Is it the goal to ensure them a certain kind of life in the long run, or shall they be totally eradicated? He's all ready to carry out mass murder, but he needs a green light, total clarity. I can't do this without knowing that this is actually what we're going to do. And this is what various Nazis, in a sense, are struggling with in August and early September. They sense where things are going, but they need clarity before they can actually do it. How is that clarity achieved? Well, it's achieved really in two ways. One is that they begin to experiment with how you would transfer the gassing technology of T4 to much larger scale operations in the East. And in fact, 3 different kinds of poison gas experiments go on in September of 1941. One is that they test whether you can create mobile gas vans. Can you use the carbon monoxide from a truck engine and funnel the exhaust from a vehicle into a sealed compartment, and is that going to kill people and quickly enough and conveniently enough? And the answer is yes, and that works is one way you can do it. A second is you can create stationary gas chambers much larger than the small ones in the euthanasia centers in Germany. And so in southern Poland, they experiment with sealing up a peasant hut, hooking it up to a captured German Russian tank engine, and again, use simple exhaust gas. Obviously, you cannot take canisters of pure carbon monoxide, such as they had used in the euthanasia program, and send that east by the trainload and kill Jews in the east by pure carbon monoxide produced in the chemical factories of Germany. But you can manufacture dirty carbon monoxide simply through an exhaust gas, and this is what they discover by testing it in September of 1939, both in mobile and in stationary gas chambers. The third thing they test is, what about fumigants, insecticides? The Germans have these concentration camps. They have an agent they use to try to deal with infestations called Cyclone B. And they said, well, if it works on roaches, is it going to work on human beings? Well, it turns out roaches are harder to kill than human beings, and that indeed Cyclone B will be an adequate way to do that, and that's tested at Auschwitz. So you have 3 different technologies being tested. In the end, the Nazis will use all 3, and that there's 3 different, in a sense, gassing technologies that are tested in September 41, and eventually camps are built to employ each of those. We know that in October, in fact, 2 of these are underway. In southern Poland, the camp at Belzec is being planned. Construction of Belzec we can actually date. The Polish slave laborers who worked on it know that on November 1st they reported for work and began the physical construction of Belzec, which means the plans for it and the bringing of raw materials and the designs all had to be there from sometime in October. After the test gassing in the peasant hut in southern Poland in late September had proven to be a go. We also know that the siting of a camp at the little village of Helmno near Lodz is also begun sometime in November. It will be equipped with gas vans, that trucks with a sealed, like a delivery van with a sealed compartment in the back, and the capacity to simply put a hose on the exhaust gas and funnel that into the airtight compartment creates a gas van. You put people in, you gas them, and you drive them to the mass grave and dump them. That will be the method used at Helmno. Both those camps, sites are selected in October. Construction begins in November. So the translation of the invention mentally of the death camp into an actual piece of real estate on the ground takes place between September and November. The third component, in a sense, is who is going to be encompassed in this. Some of my colleagues argue, well, yes, this was being done, but Helmlo and Belzec are such small camps. These were simply intended to reduce the Jewish population locally. These are local initiatives that do not signify a European-wide program, do not yet signify the regime has conceived of and committed itself to a final solution to the Jewish question in Europe, to make Hitler's prophecy of a destruction of the Jewish race in Europe come true. I will argue that is a misreading because we have one third component to fit into this as well. Not only the invention of the death camp, the beginning of the deportations, with the promise that those deported to the ghettos in Łódź and Riga and Minsk are going to be sent further east next spring to some unspecified fate. But one other key decision is taken as well. And that involves fate. The key to this is triggered by a collection of Spanish Jews living in German-occupied France. Many Spanish Jews had fought on the side of the Republic in the Civil War against Franco. When Franco won the Civil War, many Spanish refugees flee over the Pyrenees into France, including a large number of Spanish Jews. In France, there is very little resistance to the German occupation until Barbarossa, at which point Stalin orders the French Communist Party to join in the resistance and to begin assassinating and attacking German soldiers. When the first German soldiers are shot in ambushes in France in August and September of 1941, the response of the regime, of the commander-in-chief of the German army, is to carry out a vastly disproportionate reprisal. For every German soldier killed, 50 to 100 hostages are to be shot. So every resistance fighter knows for every German he kills, he's going to kill 50 to 100 Frenchmen. The local German commandants in France don't want to upset the quiescent French population, so they think, who is a group of population who, if we had to shoot at that proportion, people won't be quite so upset? And the answer is, well, we've interned a lot of Spanish Jews and other foreigners, lots of all sorts of foreign Jews, including the Spanish Jews. Shooting foreign Jews is not likely to get people upset in the way it would be if you're shooting their brother or their sister or some fellow Frenchman. So Spanish Jews in France are arrested, interned, and are among the hostages that are targeted for hostage shooting as the way to deter the resistance. The Spanish, who of course are indebted to Hitler for their victory, that is the Franco-Spanish in the Civil War, approach the German embassy in Berlin because they have to at least defend the integrity of their passports. I mean, they have to say being a Spanish citizen amounts to something. And so they go to the Spanish ambassador in Berlin, goes to the German Foreign Office, and he says, and this is on October 13th, he says to them, if you will turn over the Spanish Jews in France to us, instead of putting them in hostage pools and shooting them, we will deport them to the Spanish colony of Morocco in North Africa. We will carry out our own Madagascar plan. We'll ship them overseas to some colony in Africa, which is what you wanted to do. And the expectation, of course, in the Foreign Office is this is really good news. They write to Reinhard Heydrich, the wonderful proposal, Spanish are going to ship Jews overseas. We're going to empty Jews out of Europe. All in line with, of course, what the previous Nazi policy of expulsion was. 4 days later, the answer comes back, and it isn't what they expect. The answer from Reinhard Heydrich is no, the Spanish proposal is unacceptable. It's unacceptable, one, because the Spanish couldn't possibly guard Jews in North Africa adequately. And then there is the second sentence. In any case, Spanish Jews in Spanish Morocco would, quote, be too much out of the direct reach of the measures for a basic solution to the Jewish question to be enacted after the war. A few days after that, once they've established that you're not going to let Spanish Jews out, Himmler and Heydrich have a very long phone call. We now know this because one of the documents we got out of the Soviet secret archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union was Himmler's telephone log. And Himmler and Heydrich have a long telephone log, and Himmler's notation is end of Jewish immigration. And now the order goes out in October 23rd that to all the Gestapo and border stations in Europe, no Jews are to be allowed to emigrate from Europe any longer. What does this mean? Up until now, the vision of Nazi solution to the Jewish question is to empty the Jews out of Europe and have a Jew-free Europe. Suddenly, you want to trap them in. You don't want them to get away. You want to keep them in Europe. You don't want one of them, even a Spanish Jew in Paris, to escape. So my argument is these little death camps they're designing in the fall of 41 are not local innovations. They will be the prototypes, the testing grounds, but the vision is already there, that every Jew in Europe at some point is going to be subjected to the basic solution to the Jewish question, which will start next spring once these death camps are created and in action, and that the Nazis have now basically gone from a vision of solving their Jewish question through expulsion with high mortality rate to, in fact, holding Jews in, the reverse of expulsion, and killing every last one down to the last Spanish Jew in France that they can lay their hands on. And this is the vision of the final solution. This is the closure of that second decision-making process that settled the fate of those Jews who were west of the Nazi-Soviet demarcation line. We have a number of other documents that hint at this, but let me share one other with you. Eichmann, who is at head of the deportation apparatus for expelling Jews. Remember, he set up an expulsion center in Vienna, and then Prague, and then Berlin, and then he goes to the incorporated territories. And his friend Heinz Herpner is there in the Warthegau, and he has an Eichmann team that is spread all over Europe, who's in charge of expelling Jews. On October 23rd, that's the same day, remember, they banned immigration. All these people come back to Berlin for a conference. And we know from a surviving document that they met in Berlin on that day, but it doesn't tell us what took place in that conference. Only that all of Eichmann's team are back in Berlin on October 23rd. We also, however, have a letter that showed up in the archives of the German Foreign Office of the Jewish expert sitting there in the German Foreign Office, the guy who invented the Madagascar plan, that he received from a friend. And his friend writes to him. This friend had visited Berlin. He expected to see Rademacher. Rademacher was, in fact, somewhere else at that point. That's the man's name. And so he writes to his friend in the German Foreign Office, sorry I missed you on my visit Berlin. And then he goes on, by the way, in the metro or in the subway, I ran into an old friend who works on the Jewish question in the East. And he tells me that in the near future, most or many of the Jewish vermin will be exterminated by special measures. So it's not an official document on stationery. It's a private letter written from one person to another. And exactly the day that Eichmann's team is meeting in Berlin, and he is running into an old friend who works on the Jewish question in the East and relays that what his old friend in the East, who's back in Berlin, has just learned, the Jewish vermin are going to be exterminated by special measures. This is at the point that next week there will begin construction of Beljets. So if you put together these various kinds of hints, there's no single document that spells everything out. But if you begin to put the markers of this document, and look at what the implications of them are, I think what you get is a conjuncture that all points to the fact that by the last week of October of 1941, the deal is set, that Herpner's complaint that he doesn't yet have a basic decision, he doesn't yet have clarity. All the top leaders in the Nazi regime and many in the SS now have clarity. They now know what they are working towards, and that is the total and complete mass murder of all Jews in Europe on whom the Germans can lay their hands. If you remember, the second sentence of the Goering authorization for Heydrich was that he was to coordinate with all the agencies of the Third Reich whose jurisdiction was affected. So within weeks of this clarity being achieved, what I would say is the closure of the decision-making process in late October, suddenly Heydrich sends out invitations to a conference in which he's inviting the top state secretaries of the main ministries, as well as some representatives of the SS from the East who will share practical experience with you, are all to meet in Berlin in early December. The meeting is scheduled, I think, for December 8th. That meeting is postponed. Why? Because on December 5th, there is a Soviet counterattack around Moscow. The Nazi expectation that they were going to end the war in the East in the fall has failed. And on December 7th, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, and Hitler, in a rare case of keeping a promise, does what he had promised the Japanese if they attacked the Americans. He declares war on the United States. So at the point that this meeting was supposed to be held, in fact, all the Nazi leadership is reacting to the Russian offensive around Moscow and Pearl Harbor and the imminent declaration of war on the United States. Heydrich sends out a message that the meeting is postponed. So the meeting itself, when it finally is held, is going to be held on January 20th, 1942, much later than it had initially been intended. And that meeting is referred to as the Bonsai Conference. It is called that because it is held in a villa on the Wannsee Lake in a suburb of Berlin that the SS had confiscated. It is now a museum, a Holocaust museum. If you go to Berlin, by all means, go to the Wannsee Holocaust Memorial, and you can see the dining room in which the state secretaries and top Nazi leaders sat around the table. And Heydrich basically does two things. He establishes to them his authority to be running this program and disseminates to them what this new program is, namely that Hitler is no longer following a policy of expelling the Jews from Europe. They're all to be concentrated and sent to the East and subjected to labor, and those that do not succumb to labor will be handled accordingly. Eichmann, who was there taking notes, said handled accordingly meant that they discussed various ways of killing, shooting, poison gas, and so forth. So the Bonsai Conference at some points has been referred to as the point at which the final solution was decided on. That is not the case. The final solution was decided on in October of 1941. Wannsee is the dissemination conference, the recruiting conference. This is when Heydrich lines up all the people who are going to help him, tells them what's going to happen, wants their suggestions, wants their assent, wants their recognition to his leadership position, and gets it. Eichmann testified later that Heydrich went into the conference very nervous, did not know what would be the reaction of all of these state secretaries of the ministries to being told that there was going to be a mass murder program and they were being solicited to help. He didn't know what kind of reaction. The reaction was so overwhelmingly eager to help that afterwards Eichmann describes that Heydrich, who was very aloof, sat down and had brandy and a cigar with his men, something he never did otherwise because it was such a celebratory moment that this had gone off so well. Both the Germans and the Americans made a movie about the Wannsee Conference. The American movie was called Conspiracy. And they asked me if I would be an historical advisor for the movie. And I said no. I would read the script and tell them anything historically that was wrong in it, but I couldn't be a historical advisor because we would have cross purposes. They would be making a movie in which you had to have conflict and tension, and you would have to have Heydrich somehow dealing with somebody here or a few of them who were opposing, because you can't make a movie in which there's no conflict. And the historical importance of the Wannsee Conference is there was no conflict. Everybody agreed and enthusiastically supported it, and that's not going to make a movie script. And so I said I tried to help them not make historical howlers in it, but there was no way I was going to be able to convince them that they had to make a movie that really reflected the fact this wasn't a conspiracy. This was a joint agreement with no dispute and no conflict to carry out the final solution. So that, in a sense, then basically brought others in. It was the way in which Himmler, in a sense, Heydrich, completes his obligation to Goering under the authorization that we had talked about that began that whole process in in the summer of 1941. I think I will halt at that point. First, ask any questions, then we'll take our brief 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and start a very different topic. Yeah. It had a different protagonist. That is, in each of these, there has to be somebody who's in conflict with Heydrich. And in the German movie, it's the Minister of the Interior, a man named Stuckart, and his advice that you shouldn't include the Mischlinge first degree, you shouldn't force compulsory dissolution of mixed marriages, is the only area in which they argued about. They didn't argue about killing everybody. But what would happen to this sensitive group of part German, part Jews? And so that then became part of the centerpiece. And the American one, it was Kritzinger, who was on the right chancellery, who is seen as kind of the hesitant one with reservations and so forth. So they each had to find some protagonist and overemphasize, in fact, their role in this. Yeah. Okay, now I'd like to shift grounds from the issues of policy making and the twisted road to Auschwitz that we've actually been following for about 4 class periods now, and turn to people, the human beings that actually did this. The term we usually use is the perpetrators. That is, in a sense, a translation of the German legal term Täter, the criminal actor. But it is, like it or not, it is the term that we basically have come down with. And part of the problem in trying to deal with Holocaust perpetrators is, of course, they aren't just one kind. There's no cookie-cutter stamp out of a Holocaust perpetrator. In fact, I would start today by giving you kind of a typology of some basic types, and then we'll look more closely at one of those that you're also reading about in Ordinary Men. Certainly the most prominent, the one that first comes to our attention, are what I would call the ideologues. These are the true believing Nazi leaders. For them, the ideology is something they hold as a matter of conviction. It is their worldview. It is what shapes how they understand the world. And the motivation of the ideologues basically is not that hard to figure out. Here is a case where you have a pretty direct correlation between belief and action. They do what they do because they believe that is in fact what is required by their historical role. If in fact you accept the ideology, the war is a race war and Jews are the most nefarious threat to Germans in that race war, well then what they do to Jews is a case of belief being transmitted into action. So the ideologues are, we still have the question, why did they believe it? But at least we don't have difficulty explaining their human behavior given the beliefs that they hold. A second group are what I would call the experts. These are the very sort of the managers and top experts in society that any modern society deals with. Most famously for the Nazis would be, say, the officer corps, the field marshals and generals that conquer all of Europe and put in the Nazi grasp all the Jews they're going to kill. Without the officers running the German army and its military success, you don't have the situation in the first place out of which a final solution could be carried out. The captains of German industry, the people that create the tanks and the air forces and the equipment that arms that German army and turns Germany from an economic powerhouse into a military powerhouse. We have particularly strong in the SS, since it was an elite organization, where elites go in any society. The doctors and the lawyers are prominent professions that are much more heavily represented in the SS, say, than in others. Perhaps the iconic symbol of the expert would be Albert Speer. He is the architectural expert that takes over then the coordination of the German war economy in the latter parts of the war, and despite the bombing, manages to significantly increase German war production despite the ever heavier bombing. So the German war production is increasing into the fall of 1944, despite every Allied attempt to bring it to a halt. And after the war, of course, Speer, like many of the generals, said, "Oh, I'm just apolitical. I'm just an expert. I designed buildings, and then I coordinated this and that. I'm not a politician. I just serve the government with my expertise, and that I can't be responsible for the policies of the government. I just realize them because I'm just the apolitical expert, and that's what we apolitical experts do." Military people fight wars and conquer territory. Industrialists build tanks and airplanes. And Speer will build monumental parade grounds like at Nuremberg and organize munitions production if that's what he's asked to do. Of course, that is a whitewashed image. We now know, as we look at these people much more carefully, one can be an expert and also have very deep ideological beliefs. They are not mutually exclusive. And the apolitical stance or claim that most of these experts made after the war, once you get into their own papers and their own documentation, proves to be a very thin or entirely false claim, that they were not political innocents like Speer managed to fool many people at Nuremberg. So he was one of the Nazi leaders that was not hung. He got a 20-year sentence, got out of jail, and wrote many books and became very wealthy. But he managed to pull that off better than the others. A third level might be what I would call the mid-level managers. These are the bureaucrats and organizers that basically will implement and often be the problem solvers that are needed when policy hits reality. And then suddenly you get all sorts of unanticipated issues that have to be settled, all the kinds of unanticipated consequences that have to be dealt with, all of the bookkeeping and all of the record keeping and all of the problem solving of the final solution basically are in the hands of mid-level functionaries who are going to be able to make it work. These are the people working towards the Fuhrer who don't have to wait for orders. After the war, of course, the standard thing was I was just following orders, and if I hadn't, terrible things would have happened to me. What choice did I have? And in reality, of course, they are solving problems on their own initiative, anticipating what is expected of them, and trying to, in fact, advance their own careers by proving their worth and their value to the system. They're often referred to as the desk murderers. That was a phrase the Germans used after the war, as the people who never killed a Jew, never beat a Jew, often never saw a Jew, but made it possible they schedule the trains. They don't take the Jews to Auschwitz, but they have the trains that somebody else puts on them, puts Jews on. They design the death camp. They don't be the ones who push Jews into the gas chambers and dump in the Cyclone B. So they have the sanitized relation to this of basically being separated from their victims. They aren't directly involved with the victims. But it turns out, again, when we see many of these people, they aren't exactly desk murderers. Many of them are going out on assignments and go from Berlin out elsewhere, see what's happening, are asked to do that so they know how to solve problems better and come back to Berlin. Many of the Einsatzgruppen commanders had Berlin desk jobs, rivaled and fought one another to get an Einsatzgruppen assignment so they could, quote, prove themselves in the East, and then would come back to a promoted desk assignment in Berlin. If one looks at the people who met at the Bonsai Conference, or if you look at the collection of the top Einsatzgruppen leaders, these are not thugs. A majority of them had PhD degrees. The commander of Einsatzgruppe C was Dr. Otto Rosch, to make sure you know he had 2 PhDs. This is the way Germans do things. So we're not talking about political innocence, and we're not talking about these mid-level order followers who are sitting at their desk, who see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil, don't know what the consequences of what they are doing. They are, in fact, working towards the Führer and are doing that all too efficiently. And then finally, another group that I think we can single out are what I would call the grassroots killers, people that we meet in the Reserve Police Battalion 101 or the SS people in Treblinka, the ones that are actually left with the physical job of killing. And they, of course, pose to us maybe the most difficult problem because we find that what they did the most unimaginable of the activities of all of these. The question is, how was this humanly possible seems to loom even more so when you're talking about how could you be there and run a death camp? How can you be in a firing squad of Reserve Police Battalion 101 or Einsatzgruppe B and simply kill people at point blank range all day, every day, women, children, elderly, totally unarmed and defenseless people. So the issue of the grassroots killers is perhaps the most challenging to us to try to make sense of, to try to find some kind of explanation. And so I would focus on them more than the others now and try to deal with how people have tried to come to grips with that. Certainly, immediately after the war, virtually all of these low-level killers that were caught or put on trial had one answer, one explanation. I had orders. If I had not done it, I would have been put up against the wall, or I would have been sent to a concentration camp. My family would have. That I operated under total duress. Somebody else made me do it. I did not do it of my own agency. I did not have human agency. I was simply a tool in the hands of someone else. And of course, if you don't have agency, you don't have moral and legal responsibility. So this was the way to try to dodge, in effect, the legal consequences of their actions. When, and of course, we know, of course, the Nuremberg trials tried the very top people. What is much less well known is that from the late 50s all the way until now, in fact, last year or so, there have been a large series of German trials. If you want to study perpetrators, you have to go look not at the top leaders who the Allies tried briefly, but the hundreds of people who were tried in a sequence of trials in Germany. If you want to get any kind of cross-section, and certainly to get to these low-level perpetrators. And so there grew up in Germany a whole cadre of lawyers. They were usually young law graduates who were assigned to defend one of the German defendants at Nuremberg, and then, once these German trials started, made that their specialty. And they would travel from trial to trial. I would look in my court records. I'd run into the same lawyers time and again because they were the specialists. That was their legal specialty. And what we now know is, despite the claim of duress, that in not a single trial and a single case has any of these defense lawyers been able to find a single documented case in which someone who refused to shoot unarmed civilians suffered any kind of significant consequence. The notion that I was under total duress is a post-war alibi for which there is no historical evidence. And the absence of that historical evidence is so broad and has, been under search for the one case. Imagine if they could just find one case, what they would cite, but they cannot find it because it did not happen. We do know the Nazis, of course, repressed resistance and opposition very fiercely, but being, quote, too weak to kill was not a crime under Nazi Germany. It may have not got you a promotion. It may have gotten you a bad letter in your file. It may have gotten you a bad evaluation, but it did not make you subject to severe penalty of any kind. The next backup position was punitive duress. Well, maybe I wouldn't have been shot, but I thought I would. I had a screaming lieutenant telling me I had to do this. How was I to know that if I had tested the system, I would have gotten away with it? So punitive duress became, in a sense, the next line of defense. And that is one reason why Reserve Police Battalion 101 as an historical case is so important. Because here we can demonstrate with the speech of Major Trapp on the morning of the first massacre at Josefhof that he, in fact, offered anyone out that wanted to get out. and it remained the unwritten rule of the battalion thereafter that no one could be coerced to shoot, and this went on for the entire period, and of course it did not dent the body count of the battalion in any significant way. Having choice did not mean these people did not become killers. On the contrary, the vast majority killed anyway. So neither coercion or duress or punitive duress enables us to explain the grassroots killers. A second approach was to say, well, these are psychopaths. There's something psychologically wrong with them. These are individuals who do things that are so horrible that normal people don't do that. So they must be psychologically abnormal. And the theory that was devised initially after the war was the authoritarian personality. There are some people who are simply wired different than the rest of us, and they gravitate to these opportunities. They're self-selected. The problem, that when you began to try these people, one encountered, is they had absolutely no traits that indicated they were going to become psychopathic mass killers before they joined a killing unit. And after the war, they led perfectly legal lives. They mowed their grass. They were kind to their neighbors. They gave candy to the neighboring children. They never got parking tickets or jaywalked. They were model law-abiding citizens. But suddenly, in this period, they had become allegedly psychopathic killers. And so the theory behind the authoritarian personality is people have, quote, sleeper traits. Some of us, it is alleged, have certain traits that remain dormant. But when you are put in the circumstance of a totalitarian regime that will offer and reward people who will awaken the dormant traits and become psychopathic killers, they will gravitate to that, they will be promoted in that system, they will rise in that system. And so the concentration camp guards and the Einsatzgruppen killers and so on and so forth are all to be seen as kind of self-selected people who did what they did because their dormant abnormal characteristics, their sleeper traits got awakened. They fulfilled this latent potential to be psychopathic killers. They had this authoritarian personality that distinguishes them from us. We could never do that kind of thing, but those with these fateful sleeper traits could, and those who are the ones who are selected and self-selected and prosper and rise and move into these kinds of positions in a totalitarian regime. Again, an importance of Reserve Police Battalion 101 as a test case is the utter randomness with which these people were selected. They are the dregs of the manpower pool in the middle of the war when there's no one else to get. They're the last people to volunteer. They're there because they didn't volunteer, because they hadn't indicated any particular Nazi sympathies or sought out and volunteered for military service or SS or anything else before that. They are the last people that can be conscripted in a relatively careless and random way at this stage of the war. And yet, as you read the book, you know they are capable of acting in the same way as what the authoritarian personality is supposed to explain. So I think the notion that we're going to deal with this phenomenon in terms of individual traits, of this being an exercise of abnormal people, abnormal psychologically, I don't think is going to work. A third then is to look, well, if they're not individually abnormal psychologically, maybe all of German culture is abnormal. Maybe there's something not rotten in the state of Denmark, but something rotten in the culture of Germany. And that we must look to the flaws and corruption of German culture. And one of those approaches, of course, went back to what we had talked about earlier in the so-called German Sonderweg, that Germany was an exceptionally illiberal, militaristic, authoritarian personality where democracy could not, the seeds of democracy could not sprout and grow, and that Germans just had a tendency to obey orders. Caricature of the German in the worst of the war movies, it's the click your heels, jawohl, mein Herr, and you simply automatically, robotically obey orders, was in a sense what was being proposed here as a typical German culture trait. That, of course, doesn't explain initiative as opposed to obedience. And we see the main problem we have is all those people working towards the Führer, not those who are clicking their heels and saying, Jawohl, mein Herr, on the one hand. And then the fact is, of course, we know in German history there have been these attempts to get a more democratic order. 48 failed, 1919 failed. But after World War II, very rapidly, Germany did democratize. And it democratized without some cultural revolution, brainwashing, whatever, that in fact Germans could become Democrats. And they did fairly successfully once the systemic obstacles in the way of that were removed. So it doesn't seem that there was a cultural barrier that was uncrossable. Another explanation drawing from German culture is, as Daniel Goldhagen's offer, and that is that Germans were the carriers of a particularly lethal anti-Semitism, an eliminationist anti-Semitism. Others discriminated against Jews. Germans wanted to kill Jews. And he used such phrases as that Germany from Luther on was, quote, pregnant with genocide, and that Hitler simply unleashed and unshackled to do what the Germans had been longing to do, and that when they had the chance, they did it with gusto and enthusiasm and enjoyed themselves doing it. There were examples of people who fit that description. I think he's mistaking the part for the whole, and that describes a small portion of the killers, but not, in fact, most of the people in a unit like Reserve Platoon Battalion 101. It also, of course, does not explain how it was that for the Third Reich, we don't have to just explain the Nazi murder of the Jews. Many of the killers weren't German, and many of the victims weren't Jews. The Nazis murdered millions of people that were not Jews, and they recruited hundreds of thousands of people who weren't Germans to be perpetrators. So any cultural explanation that can focus only on the German-Jewish confrontation is not going to account for 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war, 200,000 German mentally and physically handicapped. It is not going to account for the hundreds of thousands and millions that are murdered in reprisals and in anti-partisan actions in Russia. And all of these had killers, and is not going to account for the hundreds of thousands of collaborators around Europe, from the French police and the Hungarian police to the Ukrainian police units and so forth, that are integral to the manpower of Nazi mass murder. So I would argue that that leaves too many gaps and is not going to explain. So where do we go? And my argument, as you will see when you're reading Ordinary Men, is we must shift from a focus either on individual psychopathology or a cultural explanation that deals only with Germany, and look at wider issues of human nature and look at wider dynamics of group interaction. The people that killed Jews in the Holocaust were not individual killers. This was a group endeavor. And we're going to have to explain how it is that people acted in concert to carry out mass murder, and thus we have to look not at individual psychology, but at social psychology. What do we know about how people's actions in groups is affected and shaped and manipulated, to understand why a unit of randomly conscripted middle-aged policemen can be turned into a totally lethal killing unit in the case, say, of Reserve Police Battalion 101. So what I'd like to do next is sort of move to some of the social psychological insights that we've got. There was a cluster of experiments in the late 50s and early 60s, and then not much, and then in the 90s we had some new contributions that I think we can bring in as well. Perhaps the first experiment we should look at is that of a man named Solomon Asch that experimented with the power of conformity as a factor shaping group behavior. And that experiment was fairly simple. You took a group of people who were put into a sort of a classroom kind of framework with a teacher or professor or front, and there is one unwitting test subject in the group. All the rest of the group are Confederates. Almost all these early experiments were not, what we would now say, do not meet the test of informed consent. Everything is hooked upon the test subject not being informed and not knowing how he's being, his ignorance of the situation is being exploited to test something. That doesn't nullify the significance of the result. It would mean that today social psychologists would have to devise the experiment in a very different way to test the same phenomenon. How powerful is conformity in shaping human behavior in a group context? But in any case, the experiment works like this. So the instructor draws on the board 4 lines, 3 are long and 1 is short, or he has 4 sticks, 3 are long, 1 is short. And he goes around the room and he asks one person after another, which is the short stick? And one after another, they all give the wrong answer. Until you finally get to the unwitting subject, and that person is then faced with the choice. Do I tell everybody else in the room that they are stark raving mad, stupid, and don't know what's going on, and I alone am right, and this is obviously the short stick? Or do I go along to get along? And don't pick a fight, don't criticize my comrades, swallow hard, and point to the same stick they did, even though I know that's a wrong answer. And the preponderance, the vast majority of the test subjects, in fact, opt for conformity over confronting everybody around them and telling them they're wrong. Now, that's an innocent setting. Nobody's getting killed. But what it does show is how powerful conformity is in a group setting in shaping people's behavior. A second experiment was the so-called Milgram experiment. And Milgram has had a very checkered reputation since then. There are very harsh critics of him and others that think he was very innovative and cutting edge. In any case, he did an experiment that he called the obedience experiments. I think they really should be a test in deference to authority, because they're not getting orders, they're deferring to the authority, and I think that's even more crucial. But the experiment is set up as this. Milgram was a social psychologist at Yale, and he put it in the advertisement in the paper that if you wanted to earn money as a test subject, come to this storefront where he and volunteer, and you get your $5 if you did whatever it was, and people come and volunteer. So it's a totally random, whoever answers the ad comes. And they then are taken into the laboratory that's inside the building after they're from the waiting room in pairs. And of course, the test subject does not know the other person with him is an actor, and that he is the only test subject volunteer in this. The other people, in fact, are all scripted. And they are greeted by a man in all the paraphernalia of scientific authority. White lab jacket, clipboard, pen, and the man explains that they're going to do an important experiment for progress and learning, that this is part of how science will move forward, to test whether pain enhances or does not enhance the capacity to learn. So you're going to take part in advancing science. And for that, you're going to get paid. But you're going to contract to follow the instructions of the man who's running the experiment. And if you don't follow your instructions, you'll ruin the experiment and set science back. So the actor they then flip a coin or randomly choose. And the actor is strapped into a chair, hooked up with electrodes, and the unwitting test subject is taken to a control panel with buttons or levers, and it is marked with wattages that each of these buttons relates to, 30, 60, 90, whatever, up to 420. And if you don't catch that, it then says, mild, moderate, medium, severe, dangerous, XXX. So it's read out to you. And then the experiment begins. And the man at the panel is to read pairs of words to the man in the chair. And that after that, to see how he's supposed to repeat back and to be able to memorize the pair. And when you got one half of the pair, he's supposed to get the other. Now, there's various variations in which this is run. One variation is in which the man at the board is told, when there's a wrong answer, you must punish the learning subject with a jolt of electricity, but you do not specify how much. And overwhelmingly, if you think you're taking part in a learning experiment, they would toggle between 30 and 60, the two lowest numbers, and give a mild shock as a response to a wrong answer. These were not sadists looking for an opportunity to hurt people. Left to their own, they will do as little harming as they can. The second variation, the key one, is the stipulation that with every wrong answer, you must push the next highest button. And at that point, the actor in the chair goes through a program script so that he's exactly the same in his response to every person who goes through this. At first, you begin to complain, ouch, that hurts. And then you begin to say, let me out, I don't want to do this. Then you begin to say you have a heart condition. Then you begin to moan and scream, and then you fall silent. He's in another room. One variation is you're with the same room. Another variation is another room. You hear it, but you don't see it, and so on. But in any case, the key thing is that the person at the control panel is getting that program feedback and is told he must continue the experiment. Almost invariably, the person at the panel begins to sweat, bite their lip, begin to look very worried, then turns to the experimenter and says, "What do I do?" And he says calmly, "Please proceed. You must go on. The results of the experiment depend upon you. You're not responsible for this. We're responsible for this. Don't worry. Nothing. We take responsibility. But you must proceed." And what they found is about 2/3 of the subjects would in fact go all the way up to the high range. And about 1/3 of them at some point would quit and get up and say, "I won't do this," and walk out. So that those that went up the high range didn't enjoy what they were doing. They were very upset about what they were doing. They were traumatized by what they were doing, but they did it anyway. All because they were deferring to the scientific authority of a man in a white coat and a clipboard who says this was important for scientific progress. And that was testing, in Milgram's view, obedience, and I don't think that's the right word. I use the word deference to authority. They were deferring to the scientific authority of the experimental supervisor and following his instructions. And what we see then is a deference to authority is in fact a very powerful way in which if you've entered into some kind of arrangement, that is, you've taken on a certain relationship, you've agreed to be a test subject for a scientific person, and you recognize his authority, it's very hard to break out of that and to walk away from that. A third experiment was done by a Stanford social psychologist named Zimbardo, and he was testing what we would call role adaptation. To what degree does taking on a particular role shape your behavior and change your behavior? And so he, again, like Milgram, called for a group of volunteers, and these were all college-age males. And out of that pool of people, he then gave psychological tests to eliminate anybody that was off the chart in any particular way, including what psychologists had then developed as the authoritarian personality test. Let's get anybody who tests bad on that out of the pool immediately. So insofar as the state of psychological science in the 60s permitted to classify somebody as perfectly normal, this was the pool in which Zimbardo was going to draw from. He then did random. There's no fake person in this. He then drew straws randomly. Half of these people were going to become prisoners, and half of them were going to become prison guards. And then on a certain day, police actually drove up to your house, arrested you, took you in, strip searched you, put you in a little hospital gown, which left you totally vulnerable. I mean, you know those hospital gowns that are open and back and barely come below your waist. I mean, speak of feeling vulnerable. And the prison guards are dressed in spiffy uniforms and high leather boots and sunglasses, so you can't even look them in the eyes. So you create a prison environment of total asymmetrical power between a nearly naked prisoner and a powerful, well-dressed, spiffy prison guard. Now, the hook is that the 12 prisoners are always there, but the prison guards are there in shifts of 3. So 3 prison guards have to figure out how to dominate 12 prisoners. And they are not allowed to use physical punishment. They can't hit or strike or physically torture, but they are allowed to invent any other method of gaining domination over their prisoners in order to play out and realize their goal of their duties as a prison guard dressed up in their new prison guard finery. Zimbardo thought the experiment would go 2 weeks. After 1 week, he had to call it off because it had spun so much out of control that among the 12 guards, There was a middle group that would follow orders, follow procedures. That was any time a question came up, they'd look in their book and figure out what they were allowed to do and what they should do, and they just followed standard procedures. There were two, quote, good guards that were caught on camera. They didn't know they were being filmed, that when no one else was looking, would do acts of kindness to the prisoners to mitigate what they were experiencing, but only when no one else, they thought no one else saw. They wouldn't do that in front of any other guard. And then there was a core of tough guys who enjoyed and learned how to develop ever-increasing ways to torment their prisoners and to get high on the power that they now had, that they adapted to this role of prison guard with zeal, with enthusiasm, and became ever more inventive to the point that Zimbardo had to call the experiment off halfway because it was simply spinning out of control. And so he demonstrated that, in fact, putting on a prison guard uniform and role-playing a prison guard, even in a very brief period, in fact, changed the way people behaved. They were changed by the position they had and the opportunities and power that they could exercise. So those were several: moral adaptation, deference to authority, conformity we knew about. In the 1990s, several other contributions, I think, came in and that deserve some stuff. At the very time I was writing Ordinary Men, two Harvard people, one a social psychologist and one a psychiatrist, Hamilton and Kellman, were writing a book called Crimes of Obedience. But it wasn't about the Nazis and it was not about the Holocaust. It was about American troops in Vietnam. And trying to look at how did you understand the response of American troops to criminal orders in Vietnam. So it's a different culture, different circumstance, different sets of orders, different policies they're following. But they were looking at how ordinary soldiers become perpetrators of and implementers of criminal orders. And Hamilton and Kellman said basically there were sort of three ways in which people related to what they considered to be criminal orders. One of them were the true believers. That is, they not only believed in the orders they were receiving, but they believed in the spirit behind that. They believed in the cause for which they were there. So they could be counted upon to go beyond the letter of the order, to carrying it out with enthusiasm, and always, in a sense, be reliable and to extrapolate, in a sense, from the orders they received. They were those that they called the role adapters, people who wouldn't have done what they did other than that they were in Vietnam in an army uniform. That they would not, they didn't believe in the policies and orders they were implementing, but they did believe it was their obligation to be a good soldier. And a good soldier obeys orders. Armies that don't have discipline, armies that don't follow, people who put on a uniform and then don't behave in the way that people in uniform were supposed to, then the system collapses. So these were people, they said, basically could be trusted to carry out orders. If you gave them the order, you didn't have to supervise them. They'd carry out the order because they realized that as a soldier, they had taken on that obligation. They didn't necessarily think it was the right thing. They would not have given those orders themselves. They wouldn't have chosen to do them. But once given that order, told to implement that policy, they did so because they thought that's what a good soldier does. And they did believe in being a good soldier, even if they didn't believe in the particular orders and policies that their good soldiering was being put to. The third group were the ones who were nominal compliers. They were people that obeyed orders and carried out policies so they wouldn't run into trouble themselves. And the minute there was no supervising officer, they stopped what they were doing, lit up a weed and had a good smoke, and basically volunteered for nothing, avoided all they could do, and did only what somebody made them do when they were supervising, and after that they were not reliable to carry out any kinds of policy whatsoever. So they would nominally comply only under supervision. What they also found, I'll hold on that. We also then, another concept that was put in at this time was that of cognitive dissonance. And the notion of cognitive dissonance was basically this, that when people are raised with certain values and certain moral norms, and then are put in a position where they must behave in a way utterly contradictory to the moral norms and values that they hold, they are in a period, they're going to be put into extreme stress. They're going to have cognitive dissonance. Their heart tells them one thing and their job tells them another. A secretary that must cover for the embezzlement of her boss. Whistleblowers face all the time. They see their boss doing something wrong. They know it's wrong. And what do? Do you go along and enable it, or do you risk reporting it and all the consequences that usually fall on you for reporting it? What experiments in cognitive dissonance found is that for most people, when you can't control the situation you're in, a secretary can resign her job and get another job. A soldier in Vietnam cannot resign and get the next boat back to San Diego. When you can't change the situation you're in, the way in which you relieve the distress of cognitive dissonance is to change the beliefs and norms that are causing the distress. And you begin to adopt a different set of beliefs and moral norms that will reduce the discomfort and rationalize what you are doing. The human capacity to rationalize is very powerful. And what the cognitive dissonance experiments showed is that people in an inescapable situation of cognitive dissonance, when they couldn't change the uncomfortable situation they were in, would adapt and change their beliefs and morals to remove the source of dissonance and rationalize and then begin to believe in what they were doing. And what we have, I think, witnessed empirically among killing squads and other kinds of that activity is that people in that spectrum of Hamilton and Kelman, nominal compliers, role adapters, true believers, is that over time people shift those categories. Those are not stable categories. And cognitive dissonance explains how it is that a nominal complier can become a role adapter and ultimately a true believer. That they will begin to make their situation more comfortable. One is you get drunk or get on drugs or whatever else, and that's one answer soldiers had in Vietnam. The other is you become a true believer. That you begin to rationalize what you're doing, and you begin to justify what you're doing, and you change the belief system and the value system that was causing your distress. So these are all aspects of social psychology, of factors that shape human behavior, whether it's German, American, whether it's Holocaust or some other situation. These are more universal aspects of human behavior that shape how people react in groups, and why groups will behave in ways that individuals in the group would never do on their own, but as part of a group will begin to change themselves. They will be changed by what they are doing, and in a sense become the professional killers that a group of middle-aged men in Reserve Police Battalion 101, for instance, do become. When I made the argument I did that we should understand this more in terms of group dynamics, that we should understand it more in terms of universal aspects of human nature and group interaction, it did meet some criticism, and I wanted to sort of go through what some of those criticisms are in the next minutes that we have. One of these was people who simply reacted negatively to the notion that you should import social psychology into historical explanation. And they claimed a moral grounds for that. Social psychological explanation, it was claimed, is morally exculpatory. You are removing agency from these people. You are not making them responsible for what they did, and that it is, in a sense, not only historically wrong, but morally wrong to write an interpretation of the behavior of the killers that incorporates and leans on and invokes social psychological explanations, because you're letting them off the hook. I think that is wrong. I think that does not understand the issue. Social psychologists themselves have argued and realized that other people invoke their explanations as exculpatory, view their explanations as exculpatory. That is a common perception, but that common perception isn't necessarily a correct perception. So the issue we have is not, is that a common perception? It is. Is that a fair and correct perception? I would say no, for the following reason. All of these experiments will show us that if you have a group of people, a fair number of them will behave in a way that we look on and we look on askance and disappointed. All of them also show that there is a significant minority that is capable of saying no, that exercises human responsibility and says, I won't do that. Or says, no, you're crazy. That isn't the shortest stick. Or, whatever. Or will do acts of kindness to the prisoners when they don't think they're being watched. So that people retain their ability to make these decisions. The fact that we can predict a distressing number are going to make what we would view as the wrong decision doesn't mean that they're not morally responsible for the decision they made and they didn't have a moral decision and they made the wrong one. What really is distressing us is the majority in these situations don't make the decision that would comfort us. They make the decision that makes us look in the mirror and realize, in that situation, I might have done that too. And that is not a comfortable situation. So what you do is you kill the messenger. The social psychology, the bad message, shoot the messenger. And that, I think, is just simply off point. If anything, these experiments show people in each of these are individuals. They each make an individual decision, even if the culmination of those individual decisions is not weighted in the way that would make us feel good about ourselves. So I reject the notion this is morally exculpatory. I mean, that is something I've gone around circles with people. They aren't persuaded, but I'm not persuaded by their argument either. A second objection to this is that it ignores ideology and culture, that it is too much situational. And I think that there is some truth in that, and that we do have to figure out how to blend, in a sense, the situational with the cultural. Let me give you an extreme example. Say you had taken a New Guinea Highlander who has no concept of what science is, and you'd put him in Milgram's chair in front of the panel, and you told him he has to do this because it's important for science. Would that experiment work? No, because culturally, that person isn't seen as a legitimate authority. Culture defines who is authority, who has legitimacy. Culture helps us read the situation we are in. The situation is not a neutral blank sheet that's the same for everybody. Anybody in a situation is going to read that situation through the cultural lenses and the individual dispositional lenses they bring to the situation. Individuals will react differently, and people in culture will in some ways react differently to the situation they find themselves in. So we do have to have a cultural factor. And it may be, in fact, that when you put Germans in uniforms, this affects their behavior somewhat more than putting an Italian in a uniform, or somewhat more than a Portuguese in a uniform. That there are certain, indications that militarism is indeed a higher value in some cultures than others, and that would affect role adaptation to a degree. So yes, we do have to have a cultural component and realize it is part of the picture, that we do read situations we are in through the cultural lenses that we're wearing, just as we read them differently through the individual dispositional lenses that we're wearing, that we're each individuals with our own particular take on things, and that both of those count and make a difference. So I do think one of the critiques, one of those valuable critiques of this dispute over social psychology was by a Chicago social psychologist, Newman, who argued that, in fact, situation and culture ideology are not binary opposites. They are, in fact, two sides of the same coin, and you can't separate them. They are, in fact, intertwined in such a way that they're inseparable. And you read situation culturally just as you read it individually. And so disposition, culture, and situation all are part of the same package, and that does have to be factored in. Another criticism that was made was that Reserve Police Battalion 101 is not typical, not representative, and that most of the Nazi killing units were made up of SS people like Einsatzgruppen, and that this group of middle-aged, randomly conscripted working class from Hamburg is not representative. And again, there is some truth to that. If we look, in fact, at the police battalions, we take just them, won't go into the Army and SS, we find that there are, in fact, 3 generations of police battalions. There were the reservists who were recruited, volunteered, basically, before the war, who are in reserve units from 37 to 39, like American Reserve, National Guard. They go to summer camps, they go to weekend training, and in 39, they're mobilized, put into battalion units, indoctrinated, trained, and then sent out to occupied territory, have long experience imposing German racial imperialism before they go into Russia and begin killing large numbers of people. So there is indoctrination, there is training, insofar as they volunteered and you could accept who you wanted before the war, there is some selection, and given that they're volunteering, they have a significantly higher proportion of Nazi Party membership than the population around them. The second group were the so-called 300-level battalions. These were younger men. When the war starts, the Army and Himmler make a bargain. All sorts of career policemen will be shifted to the military to become military police, MPs. In turn, the military will make available a large pool of volunteers from which the police can select and put into young police battalions that all had the 300-level designation. This of a younger generation of volunteers, too, again, are highly Nazified, and they, too, undergo lots of indoctrination, lots of training, lots of prior experience of Nazi occupation before they go into the Soviet Union. So we can say that in those kinds of battalions, they are more Nazified, there is more selection, there is more indoctrination, there is more training, and there is more experience in imposing Nazi occupation policies before they reach the step of mass killing. And then there's the third group, that by the middle of the war, 1942, you had a second kind of reserve battalion, and that is like 101. You simply randomly conscripted middle-aged men. You extended the age of compulsory wartime service from 35 to 48. And these people the Army didn't want, so they wouldn't go into the Army, but they would be drafted for non-Army military duty. And this is the 101. The average age is 40 years old. And they are conscripted randomly in Hamburg. Their Nazification is not different from anything else. They are brought in at a time that there's no longer time to indoctrinate them and train them. They're thrown together. They're sent to Poland, and in 3 weeks they carry out the Józefów massacre and go on to become a killing unit. How good of a killing unit? When you add up the body counts of all the police battalions that the Nazis employed, over 100, Reserve Police Battalion 101, the ragtag group of middle-aged conscripts that are not Nazified, not indoctrinated, not carefully selected, not having prior occupation experience, are the fourth most lethal killing unit in the German Order Police. So my argument is the following. It is true they are not typical, but the news is not good. The news is you can take an untypical unit and with no selection, no Nazification, no indoctrination, no careful training, nonetheless turn them into the fourth most lethal killing unit in the German Order Police. So I may have lost the battle on representation, but I win the war in terms of what ordinary men are capable of. But that was another sort of argument that went on. And finally, there was an argument that over who is reading these post-war interrogations correctly. These are, of course, people being interrogated in the 60s. They have every reason. Not only do you have the issues of human frailty of human memory and reinventing our past 20 years later in an entirely new situation, but they also have motive to consciously lie and obfuscate and to not answer their interrogators truthfully. So everybody agrees these are problematic interrogations. But basically, Daniel Goldhagen's argument was that I was duped. I didn't read them correctly. I accepted their lies. And my argument was he mistook the part for the whole, took only the group that he liked, and ignored all the rest. And so how do we sort that out? I would say both of us agreed that there was a band of interrogations that neither of us would accept. They are so transparently false, so transparently mendacious, that no sensible person reading them would think that they're worth anything at all. And then there was a group of interrogations that are so self-incriminating Admit doing such terrible things, nobody would admit to those if they weren't telling the truth. Those are the ones that Goldhagen accepts and I accept. And then there is a middle band of people who tell some of the truth some of the time, but not all of the truth all of the time. In particular, will tell the truth about what the unit did, but will not tell the truth about what they individually did. So historically, they will let us know what went on in the battalion, but legally to the interrogator, they're not going to tell anything about their own criminality. And the question is how and if and in what way can you use that material? Goldhagen's approach was the purest approach. I will take no interrogation that has the potential to be self-exculpatory. The problem there, of course, is if you don't use any of the middle band of testimony, all you're left with are the testimonies that are self-incriminating. And if your hypothesis is that this was all done by zealous, eager killers, and you're only accepting, as he says, the testimony of people who admitted they gave themselves heart, mind, and soul to Hitler, you have the evidence that can do no other than prove the hypothesis. The evidence is best to test. If you screen out all contrary evidence, you are guaranteed to prove your proposition. You use only the evidence that is in line with what you're trying to prove. If you look at the middle band of testimony, you get a much more nuanced, much more differentiated kind of picture in which I argue some of the people wouldn't ever shoot, a number shot but didn't shoot eagerly, never volunteered, and a hard core of eager killers emerged that enjoyed what they were doing, volunteered for Jew hunts, and got high on the power and the ability to kill people with total impunity. And that particular group of eager killers did not represent the group as a whole, but that's the group that Goldhagen does say represents the group as a whole. Can we test those who's reading the interrogations correctly? There's a number of, we have to find some kind of evidence other than the post-war interrogations. So let me very briefly just go to one case. And this would be the testimony of a man named Oswald Rufeisen, and what happened in the town of Mir, which is presently in Belarus. Oswald Rufeisen was a teenage Jew in East Upper Silesia, that Polish-German borderland. When the Germans invaded those territories and annexed East Upper Silesia, part of the incorporated territories to Germany, Oswald Rufeisen, as a teenager, fled across Poland to Lithuania. When the Germans invade Lithuania in 1941, he flees from Lithuania south into what is now present-day Belarus, and he's intercepted by the Belarusian police captain in the town of Mir who asked for his papers. And Rufeisen said, they were stolen from me, I'm wandering to escape, just to find, I have no home, I've fled Vilna, and of course all sorts of people have papers stolen. And he then explained who he was, that his origins were in East Upper Silesia, and he claims he is half Polish, half German, and he can speak Polish and German each without an accent. Unlike Polish Jews further to the east who speak with a Yiddish accent, they open their mouth and any Pole immediately knows that they're Jews. A Jew from East Upper Silesia speaking accent-free Polish and German, claiming to be half Polish, half German, sounds very persuasive. And the police captain says, fine, I need a translator who can speak German. The Germans are coming to set up a police station in this town in another couple of weeks, so you come and live with me and you will be my translator. So the 17-year-old Oswald Rufeisen moves into the house of the Belarusian police captain, awaiting the arrival of the German police. The German police arrive under Sergeant Hein. They are all 40-year-old reservists from North Germany, exactly the profile of 101, 13 German police. Sergeant Hein meets with the police captain, a man named Simeon Serafimovich. He was investigated and facing trial in England basically in the late 90s, and I was the expert witness for that trial, and that's where I met Rufeisen, and we discussed all of this. But Rufeisen basically meets with Sergeant Hein, and Sergeant Hein takes a liking to the boy. If you've ever seen the movie Europa, Europa, there's a kind of a Europa, Europa situation. Hein becomes likes this young boy, and he serves as a translator, And Heinz says, I need a translator. You'll come work for me. So here's this passing Jew, teenager, living at night in the home of the Belarusian police captain, and by day sitting at the right-hand side of the German police sergeant, handling and translating all of his business with the local population, and taking his meals with all of the 13 police inside the German police station. So here we have somebody, one, who has an inside look at the dynamics of a German police unit of exactly the profile of 101, and has absolutely no reason to be an apologist for them. He's a Jew and is trying to escape the consequences that they kill people like him. What does he say? Here's where we can check on whether my reading of the sorting out and grouping of Reserve Police Battalion 101 is accurate, or Goldhagen's argument that all of these people were eager killers is accurate. Rufeisen stays with the unit for 8 months. He's there in that police station. When he gets word that the ghetto is about to be liquidated, he goes to the ghetto and warns them, says, go to the forest. They think, of course, he's a collaborator working for the Germans. They think, or at least one or several of them, think he's acting as a provocateur, trying to get them to escape so they can all be shot down. They go to Sergeant Hein and says, your young translator is telling wild rumors that you're about to shoot us all, and turns him in. Hein summons Rufeisen and says, how could you betray me? I've been so kind to you. And Rufeisen says, you must not understand, I didn't betray you, I'm a Jew. And Sergeant Hein says, oh, we have a problem. And Sergeant Hein says, you stay here while I go think about that. And he walks out of the office, the back window is open, he lets Rufeisen escape, and he escapes into the forest and hides in a monastery, survives the war, moves to Israel, and I met him in England and then interviewed him in Haifa when he went to Israel. A woman named Hamatek has also written a book about him. There's a book called In the Lion's Den, which relates all of this as well. Key thing, what does Rufeisen, who had an inside seat of the dynamics of a German police unit, say? Well, he says there were 3 groups. He says 4 of these 13 policemen were the eager killers. Corporal Schultz was a beast in the form of a man, kept a notebook in his back pocket where he kept his body count so he could show that he had killed 80 people single-handedly by the end of the first 8 months before they'd even liquidated the ghetto. And he was the one who went out and volunteered for Jew hunts with his 3 buddies. And they came back from their killing actions and laughed and told jokes about it. A middle group of 5 people followed orders, followed instructions, never volunteered for anything, didn't mind going on anti-partisan actions, which they considered a military adventure. They didn't like going on Jewish actions, which they considered, quote, dirty. They did it anyway, but they thought it was, quote, dirty. And 4 of the police never went on any Jewish actions, assumed they had the right not to, and nothing ever happened to them when they refused to do so. So exactly the division that I had between evaders, accommodators, compliers, and eager killers is replicated in Rufeisen's account of the police station in Mir, indicating I read this material better than Goldhagen did. At least that's my argument. Okay, so in any case, that's kind of the disputes, some of the disputes over the book. I want to just, I won't do it this time. We'll start next time with one more story about, or one more aspect that is comparative. What have people found out about Rwanda and the Rwanda death squads, and what conclusions can we draw there? So we'll pick that up on Tuesday.